Good afternoon, and thank you for attending today's webinar. My name is Jennifer Cooley, and I am the Education and Outreach Manager for the State Historical Museum. During 2021, the State Historical Society is commemorating the upcoming 175th anniversary of Iowa's statehood. The Iowa History 101 webinar series, which focuses on the past lives of Iowans, continues on the second and fourth Thursdays throughout the year. You can learn more about this series and all of our programs on our website at iowaculture.gov. Please remember to sign up for each webinar you would like to attend, and don't worry if you can't watch live. All presentations will be recorded. Today, we will learn about how Black Civil War veterans of the 1st Iowa Regiment of African descent, known as the 60th U.S. Colored Infantry, and their families use the goodwill obtained through their service to fight for equal rights and social space in Iowa's communities. A few housekeeping points before I introduce our speaker. Everyone came into this webinar on mute with cameras off. Closed captions are available by clicking the closed caption button on your screen. The webinar is being recorded and will be placed on the Iowa Culture page of YouTube in a few days. I have disabled the chat function, but if you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A feature throughout the webinar. My colleague Jess Runlet is watching that feature and will prepare a list of questions for the speaker at the end of the presentation. But please note, we may not be able to get to all of the questions. Now I'm pleased to introduce our speaker, Dwain Coleman. Dwain is a PhD candidate in history at the University of Iowa and the co-director of the Iowa Colored Convention's digital project. Dwain's research examines the ways in which Black Civil War veterans, their families, and communities use the political capital or goodwill of Black military service to claim equal citizenship rights and social space in Midwestern states. He also has a forthcoming article that will appear in the Annals of Iowa entitled, "We Came Home Together, Black Civil War Soldiers and Community Building in Iowa." And now I'm very happy to turn it over to Dwain to begin the webinar.
Thank you for that introduction, and I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for all the work that you've done in organizing this presentation. I'm very excited about the research that I've been working on for a number of years, and I'm grateful for everyone who is joining us today to hear this presentation. So let's get into it. On August 10th, 1894, thousands of spectators looked on as 5,000 Iowa veterans marched one last time carrying the banners and colors they had fought in blood under during the Civil War. They were answering the Governor Frank D. Jackson's call to deliver Iowa's Civil War regimental battle flags from the state arsenal in Des Moines, where they laid unceremoniously stored, to the state capitol. There, the men would place the flags in a hermetically sealed glass case for all Iowans in future generations to see and remember the sacrifices of the men who bore them in battle. The men in this procession were themselves living memorials. Though gray-haired and bent with age, they embodied the late 19th century American ideal of patriotic masculine citizenship. Among the thousands of veterans present were some who undoubtedly stood out among the crowd. They were members of the 1st Iowa Infantry of African descent, later redesignated the 60th United States Colored Infantry. Along with the governor's call, these men were also answering another, even more pertinent call issued by the Iowa Bystander, a Black-owned statewide newspaper. The Iowa Bystander called for all 60th members to be present to represent the contributions of Black Iowans to the cause of freedom, saying, quote, "There will be no better way in which the colored soldiers can call to mind their patriotism and unselfish devotion to the country than by their assembling on this occasion and carrying their flag," close quote. This call came during the post-Reconstruction era, when Black Americans faced increasing Jim Crow laws and racial violence by those who sought to undo the political, social, and economic gains Black Americans achieved during Reconstruction. The men of the 60th, who defended Iowa and the nation during the Civil War, were representatives of their communities and continued the fight they began decades ago to secure equal rights for Black Iowans and others throughout the country. Their service during the war was about more than restoring the Union. It was about ending slavery and securing the blessings of freedom and full citizenship for themselves, their families, and their communities. The bystander listed some of the 60th members present at that Battle Flag Day ceremony, specifically naming Jason Green, Clem Miller, Alexander Fine, Lewis Mays, Anderson Hayes, John Miller, Walker Walden, who are all from Newton, Iowa. These men made Newton their home and established a flourishing and respected Black community after the war. The bystander also made special mention that Keokuk was home to many Black veterans, some of whom were members of the state's only all-Black Grand Army of the Republic, or GAR, post. Like those of Newton and Keokuk, the Black Civil War veterans of Iowa, as elsewhere in the Midwest and the country, were vital to the development of Black communities. Black community members in Iowa could claim citizenship rights and social space in Iowa's communities largely because of the political capital and goodwill that these Black veterans accrued during their military service. Having performed the role of the citizen soldier, they effectively made claims on the state and their communities for those rights previously denied them. This rhetorical battle waged by Black soldiers, activists, and Black communities was part of a long oral and literary tradition in which free Black people claimed citizenship rights based on the past military participation of their forebears in wars such as the Revolutionary War and War of 1812. By claiming full citizenship rights through this past military service, free Black people made a powerful argument for birthright citizenship. Though Iowa did not send as many soldiers to the Civil War as larger states, it holds many unique distinctions nonetheless. For instance, Iowa sent more men per capita to fight than any other state in the North or the South, sending over 76,242 men out of a population of 674,913 in 1860. Of those who served, 13,001 would never return. Iowans fought in many of the largest battles of the war, including the battles of Wilson's Creek, Shiloh, and Vicksburg. Iowa was also home to one of the largest military hospitals in the country and a national cemetery, both located in Keokuk. The memory of the dedicated commitment to the cause of union and freedom loomed large over the state in the decades after the war, leading to the need to honor the sacrifices made by so many Iowans. However, not all sacrifices made by Iowans were equally honored or well remembered. For instance, the story of the veterans of the 60th and their service during and after the war is not well known. At the turn of the 20th century, as the 50th anniversary of the Civil War approached, Americans renewed their remembrance of the war and celebrated the sacrifices of its veterans. As they did, they also purposefully tried to forget the contributions of Black veterans. The reasons for this forgetting has much to do with the desires of former rebels and Unionists to reconcile with one another. As Americans adopted the lost cause narrative and historical philosophies of historians like William Dunning gained popular acceptance, reconciliation came at the expense of Black Americans whose sacrifices went unrecognized and their equal rights denied. Still, like elsewhere in the country, Black Iowans and their white allies spent decades after the war pushing back against this white supremacist rewriting of the past and excluding Black contributions to ending the war. They did so by insisting on the participation of Black men in the political process, calling for the repeal of Black laws, celebrations like the Iowa's Battle Flag Day, Emancipation Day, and Decoration Day celebrations, and petitioning to join and organize GAR posts. But just as importantly, they participated in a myriad of everyday acts of resistance and defiance against discrimination by serving as leaders and representatives of their Black communities, helping build churches, fighting to desegregate schools, organizing labor unions, and developing vibrant and cultured societies. Though Iowa was a free territory and later state, it did not welcome Black migrants during its antebellum period. Instead, starting with the organization of Iowa as a territory in 1838, Iowa passed some of the most restrictive Black laws in the Midwest. Under Iowa law, Black people could not vote, serve on a jury, testify against a white person, were excluded from public education, banned from marrying a white person, and could not serve in the state militia. But of all the initial Black laws, the most egregious was an act to regulate Blacks and mulattoes. The act required all Black people to enter the state, who entered the state, to pay a $500 bond and present free papers to the county official. Failure to pay the bond could result in the person being hired out for 6 months to the highest bidder. But as demeaning and restrictive as an act to regulate Blacks and mulattoes was, the Iowa legislature passed an even more draconian law in 1851 that completely banned the migration of Black people from settling in the state, as seen here in this slide. The reason for these Black laws and Exclusionary Act was to make clear to Black migrants that they were not welcome in the state. White Iowans especially feared the migration of both free and enslaved Black people to the state from their slaveholding neighbor to the south, Missouri. While Iowa's anti-Black migration laws were not always strictly enforced, they did afford county officials the legal means to expel Black Iowans from the state who failed to pay the necessary $500 bond or were deemed a nuisance for any reason to the community. There are several recorded instances in which officials attempted to use these laws to expel Black people from communities and the state. One such incident occurred in Keokuk in early June of 1857, when the city marshal set out on what one local paper called a crusade to expel the Black inhabitants. By 1860, 1,069 Black people lived in Iowa. Keokuk was home to the largest Black community in the state, with a population of 245 Black residents, which was 5 times larger than in 1850. Fearing the growing Black population in the city, the marshal falsely accused the city's Black inhabitants for the rise in crime and immorality, and printed and distributed expulsion notices to Black residents. As recreated here, as recreated here, we can see the words of the, recreated in the newspaper article here, we can see the wording in which the marshal used to call for the expulsion. As the expulsion notices demanded Black residents leave within 3 days or face arrest. The city marshal only postponed his expulsion order after city business owners feared the forced expulsion would disrupt preparations to receive a group of Eastern dignitaries and railroad investors. The reaction of Keokuk city officials and many white residents to the increasing number of Black migrants to the city mirrored the concerns that many other Iowans had during this time. While many white Iowans supported the restriction of slavery to Missouri and southern slaveholding states, they were not hostile to the system of slavery, where it already existed. Many early residents to Keokuk and the rest of Iowa were Southern born. They supported the restrictions to slavery in Iowa, like their northern born neighbors, largely because they did not want to compete with the wealthy planter class and enslaved labor. Just as white residents feared the competition of enslaved labor, they also feared the labor competition of free Blacks. They believed the racist stereotypes prevalent throughout the country that portrayed Black people as lazy, prone to criminality, and therefore would become a burden and lead to increased immorality in communities. Still, many communities allowed some Black migration when labor shortages arose. They did so knowing that Black laws and exclusionary acts empowered elected officials with the authority to remove unwanted Black residents should the need arise. These Black laws and exclusionary acts made Black Iowans apprehensive and uncertain of their future status in the state. As a result, many Black Iowans began to organize and push back against these heinous Black laws and the 1851 Exclusionary Act that threatened their families and communities. One of the earliest recorded activist participations of Black Iowans against these laws came in the form of a petition. Alexander Clark, a prominent Black barber and businessman, helped organize all of the colored citizens of Muscatine County in 1855, including women and children, to sign a petition calling for the repeal of the 1851 Iowa Exclusionary Act. A year later, wealthy business owner Thomas C. Mott of Muscatine challenged the Iowa law that excluded Black Native testimonies in court when he sued a white business partner and won. His business partner appealed the ruling to the Iowa Supreme Court, which upheld the lower court's ruling. Then, sensing a growing political change on the issue of Black rights with a newly elected Republican-controlled state legislature, Alexander Clark drafted a new petition and collected 122 signatures calling for the repeal of Iowa's 1851 Exclusionary Act. The image here is an image of the 1855 Muscatine petition. Then in 1857, just months before the attempted expulsion of Black Keokuk residents, Black Iowans convened a colored convention to discuss the state constitutional convention, and the prospect of repealing the word white from the state constitution, and with it, Iowa's Black laws. In the petition sent to the state legislature, the convention delegates declared, whereas we, the colored people of the state of Iowa, in convention assembled, feel ourselves deeply aggrieved by reason of cruel prejudice, we are compelled to suffer in this our native land, which is as dear to us as the white man, knowing full well that the blood of our forefathers, in common with that of the white man, was poured out in open battlefield in defense of the liberties we now are deprived of. The continued claims to birthright citizenship used by Black Iowans was an essential rhetorical argument utilized by other Black rights activists of the early 19th century, like William Yates, Frederick Douglass, and William Nels. By claiming to be citizens by birth and by right of the blood, quote, poured out in the open battlefield, close quote, by their forefathers during wars such as the Revolutionary War and War of 1812, they were reclaiming for themselves the same rights that white Americans claimed. Military service during the 19th century was the epitome of the performance of democratic citizenship. One could not be a soldier without being both a man and a citizen. Therefore, it stood to reason that having performed the ultimate display of one's citizenship as soldiers in the past, that Black Americans had as much claim to full citizenship rights as white Americans. This powerful rhetorical argument would take on even greater significance during the Civil War as Black Iowans continued to push for equal citizenship rights and the right by petitioning to serve as, and their rights by petitioning to serve as soldiers. When the Civil War began in 1861, free Black people around the country offered their services as soldiers. Their petitions for enlistment were met in large measure with scorn, violence, and the oft-repeated refrain of, quote, "This is a white man's war," close quote. Still, many Black Americans persisted in the right to serve, believing that doing so would demonstrate once again their patriotism and worthiness to receive citizenship rights. Black Iowans also petitioned officials for the right to form a Black regiment in the state. In August of 1862, Alexander Clark sent a letter to Iowa Governor Samuel Kirkwood requesting the right to form a regiment. Clark received a reply from the governor's military secretary, Nathan Brainerd, who stated flatly, and the quote is up here on the screen, quote, "You know better than I the prejudices of our people, for you have felt them more severely, and you know your color would not be tolerated in one of our regiments. However wrong this may be, we cannot ignore the fact," close quote. Brainerd's reply represents the deep-seated anxiety that white Iowans felt over the idea of Black enlistment. White Iowans knew well what Black Iowans knew. that allowing Black men to serve as soldiers would put them on equal footing with white soldiers and on a path that could lead to equal citizenship. As Frederick Douglass put it, quote, once let the Black man get upon his person the brass letters, U.S., let him get an eagle on his button and a musket on his shoulder and bullets in his pocket, and there is no power on the earth or under the earth that can deny that he has earned the right to citizenship, close quote. But as the war raged on, heavy casualties and fears of the draft led some white Iowans to soften and even change their position on Black enlistment. One woman from Iowa City wrote to military officials requesting that they spare her fiance's regiment by allowing a Black regiment to take its place. Iowa Senator James Grimes, pictured here, expressed a similar feeling, saying, quote, would see a Negro shot down than the son of a Dubuquer. I would rather would see a Negro shot down rather than the son of Dubuquer, end quote. Such sentiments were quite common. Even amid this growing racist acquiescence to Black military service, many Black people in Iowa still sought the chance to prove their loyalty and right to reside in the state as citizens. Other important precipitants for this change in attitude among white people were the enlistment and service of other Black regiments like the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry, which was the first Black regiment to prove themselves in combat during the Civil War in October of 1862. Their success on the battlefield helped to dispel some doubts about Black men's abilities to make good soldiers. This, along with Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, which opened the door to Black enlistment in the Federal Army, led governors like Iowa Governor Samuel Kirkwood to petition the War Department to raise a Black regiment. Officials granted the governor's request on July 27, 1863, and set the rendezvous point for the regiment at Keokuk, Iowa. This led recruiters to travel throughout Midwestern states such as Iowa, Missouri, Illinois, and Minnesota, enlisting soldiers in the 1st Iowa Regiment of African descent, later redesignated the 60th U.S. Colored Infantry. At least 2 Black Iowans, Alexander Clark of Muscatine, pictured here, and George W. Black, a barber from Washington, Iowa, were among the recruiters for the regiment. Both were zealous in the recruitment efforts, believing that Black enlistment would further the cause of Black citizenship rights in Iowa. Alexander Clark, for instance, traveled as far as St. Paul, Minnesota, where he enlisted 48 men, many of whom were Teamsters for the Union Army stationed at Fort Snelling. Eager to persuade these men to join the regiment, Clark gave each of them his $2 recruitment fee, no small sum. Most of the men who enlisted in the 60th in Iowa were recent newcomers to the state, arriving as both freedom seekers and refugees. Some longtime residents who enlisted were the Triplet brothers, Isaac Newton, Lewis, and London, who enlisted in the regiment at Keokuk, where they lived. This is a picture of their brother Henry, who did not enlist. The choice of Keokuk as a rendezvous point for the 60th had much to do with its geography. Located at the southeast corner of Iowa, Keokuk was known as the Gate City, as it was the entry point into Iowa and the north by way of the Mississippi River. Unable to legally recruit Black men in Missouri, officials chose Keokuk as an ideal rendezvous point. By this time, Keokuk's Black population grew rapidly with the influx of Black refugees and freedom seekers from southern states. Many refugees were brought to Keokuk by the military to relieve the army of the burden of caring for the hundreds of people who swelled their lines almost daily in some places. White Iowa soldiers brought some Black men and women who served in white regiments as Teamsters, cooks, laundresses, and nurses back to Iowa to provide much needed labor for family farms and businesses. Many of these refugees and freedom seekers found work in Iowa communities, filling the labor roles left open by white enlisted men. Jerry White and his wife Mary were enslaved in Huntsville, Alabama. When Jerry escaped and came to Helena, Arkansas before arriving in Keokuk and joining the 60th, Mary later joined him in Keokuk and cooked and washed for the soldiers of the 60th. When Jerry left Keokuk with the regiment, quote, Mary went with him, close quote. Some freedom seekers arrived of their own means, hoping to enlist in the U.S. Army. Such was the case of Art Washington and Robert Wilson, who fled Shelby County, Missouri on foot. They eventually made their way to Quincy, Illinois, and then took a steamboat to Keokuk, where they enlisted. But Keokuk was not the only city that saw an increase in its Black population during the Civil War, or from which Black men enlisted. Many Black men enlisted in other Iowa communities like Newton, Mount Pleasant, Iowa City, Des Moines, Burlington, and others. In Newton, 16 men enlisted, including brothers John and Clem Miller, Anderson and Henderson Hayes, and Alec Nichols. All of these men were from the same enslaved neighborhood in Missouri, and having escaped together, they came to the Wittenberg-Newton area in September of 1862. Finding safety and employment, they settled in the Wittenberg-Newton area and became some of the first Black inhabitants of Jasper County. However, even with their freedom and employment secured, John Miller and his companions were not content. The men had left family and friends behind in Missouri and promised them that they would return to free them. For these men and thousands of others like them who escaped slavery and joined the Army, they saw the war as a war to free the slaves and wanted to assist in this endeavor to help free others. For John Miller and his brother Clem Miller, who John reunited with shortly after arriving in Wittenberg, freedom was a lifelong family goal that their parents Paul and Carissa Miller instilled in them. The war presented an opportunity for these men and their families and other enslaved people to seize their freedom. It could not have been easy for them to leave their families behind. For example, both Henderson and Anderson Hayes left behind wives and small children. So the men left in the hopes of creating a new life for their families and friends in the North. Shortly after the 4 freedom seekers escaped, Alec Nichols returned and freed 4 more from their Missouri community, including his brother Daniel Siegel and sister, as well as 2 of John Miller's sisters. Unfortunately, other family and friends in their community, including Louisa Bass and Henderson Hayes, who was Henderson Hayes and Anderson Hayes' sister, and Henderson Hayes' wife, Ellen Hayes, and their children, were not as fortunate and were sold shortly after the first escape. However, this did not deter the men from their hopes of one day reuniting with their families again. After Black Iowans were finally allowed to enlist in the summer of 1863, John and Clem Miller, Alec Nichols, Anderson and Henderson Hayes, and 12 other Black men from the Newton area enlisted in Company E of the 1st Iowa Infantry of African descent. Then shortly after their enlistment, they traveled together to Keokuk to rendezvous with the other members of the new regiment. Group escapes and enlistments such as that of John Miller and his companions were not unusual. Many men and women from the same slave communities escaped together and came to Iowa. Enslaved people from the same areas also often followed the same routes to freedom and settled in and enlisted from the same places. Many of these close community ties would continue both in Iowa and during the 60th service. Black Iowa soldiers were quick to use their newfound positions to make arguments for their worthiness as soldiers, men, and citizens. They did this in various ways, like dress parades through the streets of Keokuk on their way to board a steamer bound for St. Louis. As they marched, members of the Keokuk community looked on. Such a sight of Black soldiers in uniform both thrilled Black Iowans and made some white inhabitants, as one officer put it, quote, uneasy over the question of Black equality, close quote. They're marching through the streets of Keokuk, performing the role of the citizen soldier in the service of their community and nation, stood in stark contrast with the events of a few years earlier when the Keokuk City Marshal attempted to deny Black residents the rights of citizens and to expel them. But Black male soldiers were not the only ones who wished to demonstrate their patriotism and citizenship through their service. Women of Keokuk and Muscatine were also eager to show their commitment to the cause of reuniting the nation, ending slavery, and fighting for equal citizenship rights for Black Iowans. One way in which they demonstrated their commitment to these causes was by presenting the men of the 60th with a gift. On November 11th, 1863, at Benton Barracks in St. Louis, the men of the 60th and their officers gathered for a most solemn ceremony. Alexander Clark, who remained with the regiment even after failing his physical exam, did so that he might have the honor of presenting the ladies' gift of a beautiful, handcrafted silk regimental flag, which is shown here in the slide. In addressing the regiment, Clark opened by saying, "It is with unfeigned pleasure I present to you, in behalf of the ladies of Keokuk and Muscatine, this beautiful flag, their true gift to you in token of their love and friendship for the American soldier of African descent." He continued saying, "It is the flag of your country, the highest gift that you as American soldiers and patriots could receive at their hands. In this gift, they have shown themselves worthy descendants of mothers and daughters of the soldiers of Iowa." As Clark suggests, creating a regimental flag was a labor of love for the men who would bear it in defense of the nation. It was also a symbol of the ladies of Keokuk and Muscatine's patriotism and willing sacrifice for their nation as citizens. By allowing their loved ones to serve, these women took great financial, emotional, and familial burdens upon themselves and their children. Through this gift, the mothers, wives, sisters, and daughters of these soldiers were making claims on the men of the 60th and the government who employed them in the defense of the nation. For these ladies, the banner was a social contract that the government and their communities could not easily brush aside. And it reminded all that the time would come when their sacrifices would require full compensation. The flag thus became an important symbol of the bonds of obligation between the Black women of Iowa, Black soldiers, and the federal government. In Clark's final remarks during this patriotic ritual, he said, quote, "No traitors are found among the Americans of African descent. No, not one. Loyal, yes. Every one of us is a loyal citizen. Soldiers of the Iowa first," close quote. Clark made sure the Muscatine Journal published his remarks and an account of the ceremony. When he returned home to Iowa, he continued to champion the men of the 60th and, with their service, the cause of equal citizenship for Black Iowans. Soldiers of the 60th served faithfully throughout the remainder of the war, stationed largely in and around Helena, Arkansas. Helena was a point of strategic importance for the Union Army and control of the Trans-Mississippi theater of the war. Soldiers of the 60th were largely tasked with protecting federally employed contrabands, as they were often called, or free Black workers who grew crops and cut wood. The men of Company E of the 60th, including John Miller and his companions, were stationed at Island 66 on the Mississippi River. Captain George F. Work of Company E, speaking of his assignment, said, quote, "We were stationed there for about 3 months to guard a government wood yard, and until quarters were built, the boys had a hard time, and being constantly threatened with attack by guerrillas kept each one frequently on picket duty, owing to the long line to guard and the fewness of my men," close quote. The harsh conditions, malaria-infected mosquitoes, epidemics of various diseases, long duty hours, and lack of adequate housing took their toll on the men. As a result, a ghastly 332 men of the 60th, almost 30% of the regiment, would die from disease and injury, including Alec Nichols and Henderson Hayes. During these times in which the men of the 60th suffered, the Black women of Iowa stepped forward once again to show their commitment to the cause. Several wives of the men of the 60th served in the camp in many capacities, such as nursing the sick, serving as camp cooks, and as laundresses. Some followed their husbands when they enlisted and served in the regiment for years, like Mary White Brown and Elizabeth Stewart, while others like Mary Triplett, the wife of London Triplett, traveled from Keokuk to Helena with her 5-year-old twin daughters and several other women to care for her sick husband and others after over 100 men were unknowingly infected with syphilis during a smallpox vaccination. Still other Black women like Elizabeth Fairfax, pictured here at the bottom, a formerly enslaved woman in Tennessee who served with the Iowa 26 through much of the war, served with white Iowa regiments as nurses, cooks, and scouts. As historian Leslie Schwalm explains of the service of these and other women, quote, their presence in the regiment reminds us that military service was not exclusively a male undertaking. For many soldiers, wives and families were integrated into the experience of the war, close quote. Soldiers also supplemented these familial bonds with, when unavailable, by developing fictive kinship bonds as they served daily together. For some soldiers, like those who enlisted from Newton, these bonds were a continuation of the relationships that they developed with one another while still enslaved. These bonds deepened and others formed as the men endured the joys and sorrows of military life. When not on duty, soldiers spent much of their time in camp, doing many things to pass the time, such as learning to read and write, attending church services, singing and dancing, gambling, conversating with one another about the future. They also bonded in other more tragic ways. In various pension depositions for members of the 60th, former brothers in arms described the horrible physical conditions and illnesses that they suffered together. Often due to a large number of those ill at any given time and the limited resources that the regimental surgeon, Andrew Patton, could provide, they were forced to rely once again upon each other by caring for and nursing each other back to health. When Anderson Hayes contracted asthma, heart trouble, and pain in his side, Clem Miller and Jason Green cared for him. All too often during their service, they also found the necessity to bury one of their own, like Henderson Hayes and Alec Nichols. Though not all connected through blood, they were a family, and their bonds were nonetheless intricately tied to one another. These men had learned through experience that they could rely upon each other, and even after their service, saw the importance and the strength in staying together. Members of the 60th also learned to combat not just rebel forces, but also inequality. Members of the 60th, like other Black residents, pushed back against Black soldiers, pushed back against injustices such as the prejudice of white soldiers and officers, unequal treatment if captured by the enemy, the denial of promotions as commissioned officers, and unequal pay. These lessons in political activism would continue to bear fruit as these soldiers returned home after the war. One of the first ways Black soldiers of the 60th continued to participate in the political fight for equality after their discharge from the Army was by immediately holding a color convention upon their return to Iowa. When the men of the 60th arrived in Davenport at the end of October 1865, they were, quote, greeted by the authorities and the loyal thousands of Iowa, close quote. Such a reception was a change from the initially hostile position that many in Iowa and throughout the nation had taken concerning the enlistment of Black men. Here, after many years of toil, disease, death, and discrimination, many of the people of Iowa welcomed the men of the 60th home as exultant victors. They had proven that they were worthy to be called men, and many of their members had sacrificed their lives to preserve the Union. However, such a reception does not constitute evidence of an overall desire of white Iowans to grant Black men any new degree of civil rights. Like many other white Northerners, many white Iowans came to believe that Black people were entitled to basic God-given rights such as life, liberty, and happiness, but this is where they drew the line. Besides political rights, they also believed that social rights or secular privileges were rights reserved by the community for only the most worthy. However, wartime service did provide the men of the 60th, other Black Iowans, and Black people throughout the nation with an opportunity. The military service of the 60th members earned the men substantial political capital or goodwill that could influence much needed and desired policy changes concerning their status in Iowa communities and their legal status throughout the state. As such, the men of the 60th did not waste time in demanding equal rights. Upon their arrival, Alexander Clark organized a color convention for the 700 surviving veterans at Camp McClellan on Thursday, October 31st, 1865. The men chose Alexander Clark to serve as president and conferred upon him the honorary rank of Sergeant Major. When Clark addressed the veterans, he expressed his appreciation for the honor conferred on him, and then turned his attention to the matter at hand, saying, quote, "Now, my friends, we have a work to perform, and here today, a duty we owe ourselves and our race in asking for those political rights of which we are now deprived." Close quote. He continued saying, quote, "Therefore, we can now ask the legislature to do its duty and prepare the way for our approach to the ballot box." Close quote. The convention adopted several resolutions, including one which argued that the men, having fought as soldiers, now deserved the right to vote, saying, quote, "He who is worthy to be trusted with the musket can and ought to be trusted with the ballot." Close quote. Sergeants from each company then collected the signatures from each of the men in their companies. They then tasked Alexander Clark with conveying their petition and its resolutions to the state legislature at its next session. Even though black male suffrage would not be realized in Iowa until 1868 by referendum, the service of the 60th and the continued petitioning of political activists like Alexander Clark were crucial components that helped secure voting rights for Black men. As historian Robert Dykstra has pointed out, Iowa over the decades, both preceding and following the Civil War, saw a drastic shift in citizens' attitudes towards Black people. Quote, "From one of the most racist territories in the North in the 1840s, Iowa became, by the late 1860s, one of the most egalitarian states in the entire Union." Close quote. At the time of the passage of Black male suffrage in Iowa in 1868, the state became one of only 5 northern states to grant full suffrage to Black men. This transition of the Hawkeye state from racist exclusionist to the, quote, "bright radical star" of the North, as President Grant urged voters to be, owes much to the actions of the members of the 60th and the support and contributions of other Black Iowans, including women. In addition, Iowa's enfranchisement of Black men also helped pave the way for the passage of the 15th Amendment in 1870. Securing the right to vote and working towards other essential civil liberties for Black people represented one step in creating more inclusive communities. The political act of military service stood at the forefront of making this vision a reality. While Black Iowans would continue to struggle for equal rights at both the state and national level, they also had to contend with issues of race at the local level. Many of the men of the 60th chose to make Iowa their permanent home. Of the 440 men who enlisted in the 60th in Iowa, around 220 would settle in the state. As soldiers, they had represented the state of Iowa and the nation with honor. They now sought a place within the very nation and state they had helped to preserve. After the conference, they said what must have been emotional goodbyes to the men they had fought side by side, nursed, and shared hardships with. However, some of these bonds would last for the rest of their lives. Many of the veterans of the 60th chose to live together or close to one another to continue the associations they had enjoyed during their service. Others would continue to associate with one another as they visited other communities throughout Iowa and read the Iowa State Bystander, which published news on Black communities throughout the state, starting in 1894. Many veterans would decide to return to the communities they enlisted from with fellow veterans of the 60th. For example, the 9 surviving enlistees from Newton, John and Clem Miller, Anderson Fine, Daniel Siegel, Walker Walden, and Anderson Hayes chose to return to Newton. Other members of Company E also joined them, like Jason Green, Lewis Mays, and William Moore. These men all chose to settle in Newton, having lived elsewhere in Iowa before enlistment. Speaking of his relationship with Jason Green, Lewis Mays recounts that we enlisted in the said organization at the same place and the same time, and we discharged at the same time and went home together, close quote. Clement Miller, also commenting on his long relationship with Jason Green, said, quote, saw him at the time we came home. We came home together, close quote. It is interesting to think of this large group of Black veterans traveling across the Iowa prairies, returning home together. Newton was home for them, and as such, these men and their families sought to create a comfortable and familiar community. They chose to return to Newton to establish their lives and build a community for the same reasons John Miller and his companions decided to stay 3 years earlier. The Newton area was home to many Iowans, like Free Presbyterians in Wittenberg, who were progressive on issues concerning race. It was also a fast developing frontier community that eventually became a stop on the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific Railroad, and the headquarters of Maytag. With this growth came many employment opportunities for laborers. Other communities with sizable 60th populations were Des Moines, Keokuk, and Burlington. These river towns were important centers of commerce and travel that provided newly discharged men employment opportunities. Another vital issue the men of the 60th would address after returning home concerned the need to reconnect with family and friends. Like John and Clem Miller, some had already reunited with family members when two of their sisters, Elizabeth and Letty, joined them in the Newton area. Others, like Anderson Hayes and John Miller, would return for a short time to Missouri and the home of their former enslavers and their old slave neighborhoods before moving whole families back to Iowa with them. Anderson Hayes, for example, had left behind a wife he had married in slavery and 4 small children in Nottoway County, Missouri. At the time he ran away and he joined the Army. Years later, he would also bring his mother, Lavina, who he was separated from as a small child, to Newton. After the war, John Ross Miller also spent several years living in Missouri with his parents, Paulus and Clarissa Miller. John Miller then brought his parents back to Newton with him, where they spent the rest of their lives together. Such family reunions and community gatherings occurred elsewhere throughout Iowa as Black veterans and others continued the work of community building in Iowa. However, their admission as permanent inhabitants of these communities would require negotiations between Black and white members of the community. Black Americans had to compete with long-held prejudices, limited access to community resources and jobs, and other inequalities. Free Black men and women did not just seek to assimilate into white communities, but sought to reconstruct Midwestern communities to fit their ideas of freedom. To do this, they combined both old community and familial practices with new surroundings and circumstances. Veterans, their families, and communities would come to rely on the relationship and skills developed during military service, like adaptability to difficult circumstances, schooling, self-confidence, leadership skills, interest in public affairs, and political activism. The political capital of service also provided them with some level of respectability as former soldiers, Black veterans of the 60th and other USCI regiments held a position of honor in the post-World War United States. Soldiers capitalized immediately on these skills and goodwill through demands for equal education in Iowa communities. From the early days of establishing the territory, Black Iowans contended with discriminatory laws that excluded them from obtaining access to equal education. This fight for equal education continued into the Reconstruction era, and Black veterans were some of those at the forefront of this fight. Such was the case in Newton, when Jason Green and Lewis Mays began attending school in town a few months after returning home in the winter of 1865. The men likely began their education while still in the service by attending one of the schools established by the Western Sanitary Commission for Black soldiers stationed in Helena, Arkansas. Some white Newton parents were appalled at the prospect of their children attending school with those they deemed unworthy to be with their children, and demanded that school officials prevent the men from attending. Even amid this opposition to integrating the local school, Jason Green and Lewis Mays persisted in their desire to obtain an education. The prejudiced opposition in the community soon subsided, most likely due to the support and respect other community members had of these men. Years later, the Newton recorder would recall that Jason Green and Lewis Mays became apt pupils, quote, worthy of respect, close quote. Jason Green would go on to become a successful barber and businessman in Newton. The integration of the Newton schools benefited these men, but also helped to secure equal education rights for future generations of Black children in the Newton community. In 1896, the Iowa Bystander reported of Newton that it was the fashion for students to attend school until they graduated. The article added that in proportion, Newton has more Afro-American graduates than Des Moines, close quote. This fight for equal education would also play out on the state level, as activist and honorary Sergeant Major Alexander Clark and his children, Susan and Alexander Jr., played prominent roles in challenging the education color line in Iowa. After Susan Clark was denied admittance into the local school near her home in 1867, her father, Alexander Clark, brought suit against the Muscatine School Board on her behalf. The suit made its way to the Iowa Supreme Court, which heard the case in Clark v. Board of Directors, City of Muscatine. Under a technicality resulting from the new 1857 Constitution, the court ruled in favor of the plaintiff and ordered the desegregation of Muscatine schools. However, this court decision, while it opened the doors to further educational opportunities for some Black Iowans, it did not lead to full school desegregation throughout the state. Two other Iowa Supreme Court cases on equal education were also heard in 1874, when Carlotta Piles, and this is a picture of Carlotta Piles here, her daughter, Carlotta Smith, and Mary Dove brought successful lawsuits against Keokuk City School Board. This fight for equal education continued and found its way onto the college and university campuses throughout the state. Again, the Clark family was at the forefront when Alexander Clark Jr., pictured here, in 1879, became the first Black person to graduate from the University of Iowa's law school. Alexander Clark Sr. would become the second Black student to graduate from the university with a law degree in 1884. Veterans like Jason Green and Lewis Mays, along with the Clarks, Carlotta Smith, Mary Dove, and their communities all worked hard to open the door for equal education for Black people at Iowa's education institutions after the war. And they built upon their gains in striking down Iowa's Black laws and used the political momentum to push for further political, educational, and social rights. Black Iowa veterans also played important leadership roles in the community by holding political patronage positions, participating in political parties, and serving in various organizations. For example, Milton Howard worked at the Rock Arsenal for 52 years, and he's pictured here. During that time, he was a pillar of the community in Davenport, helping to found the Third Baptist Church, a Black Republicans Club, a labor union for trade assistance, and a labor union for trade assistance. Milton also served multiple times as a delegate at the Scott County Republican Convention and often gave political speeches. He was also a member of the GAR and served as a committee member for the state GAR encampment at Davenport in 1900. Like Milton, the Black veterans of Newton were known for their staunch devotion to the party of Lincoln. Even after a career as a farmer, laborer, and owner of several properties, John Miller chose to accept the appointment as custodian in the courthouse and state historical building in Des Moines, a political patronage employment position. Miller faithfully attended to this duty until December 29th, 1923, when he died of an apparent heart attack while boarding a streetcar on his way to work at the age of 82. In addition to Alexander Clark's already exemplary service as a civil rights activist, Clark would go on to play a prominent role in Iowa's Republican Party. And as a result of his service to the party, Ulysses S. Grant nominated him to be the U.S. consul to Haiti. But Clark turned down the position, citing the inadequate pay. Clark would receive another opportunity to serve the nation when President Rutherford B. Hayes selected him to serve as the minister, resident, and consul general of the United States to Liberia. He accepted the position, knowing the health dangers that seasonal diseases in the region posed. He did so because the position was the highest government appointment for any Black American, and he wished to represent Black Americans well in the position. Clark's service in Liberia would be short, and he died on June 30th, 1891, after contracting malaria. Black soldiers also participated in various community organizations like Prince Hall Freemasonry. And one of Iowa's first Prince Hall Masonry lodges was Sumner Lodge number 41 in Burlington in 1874. Like other Prince Hall lodges, Sumner Lodge acted as a local regional community networking center. Black veterans George W. Black, John Williams, Noah Cartwright, and Jason Wilson were prominent members of the Sumner Lodge. And this is a picture of the Sumner Lodge in 1920. In the post-war era, the GAR became the most important organization in the fight to honor veterans for their service to the nation. As such, membership for Black veterans in the GAR was a powerful reminder to communities of Black people's contributions to the preservation of the Union. Keokuk's large Black veteran population allowed the men to establish the only all-Black GAR post in Iowa. The Pratt post consisted of around 20 veterans, mostly former 60th soldiers, and some veterans of other Black units. Not every GAR post in Iowa was exclusively male. In Clinton, Iowa, Black veteran nurse and scout Elizabeth Fairfax was a member of the Clinton GAR post. After suffering the same deprivations while marching, nursing, and caring for the men of the 26th Iowa, Fairfax returned home with her fellow soldiers and settled in Clinton. The veterans held her in such high regard that they accepted her as a member of the GAR. She was a proud member of the GAR and often attended national encampments and became well known to veterans all over the country. With the help of the men of the 26th, she also secured a nurse's pension. The role of Black Iowa Civil War veterans was crucial to the fight for Black political rights here in Iowa and throughout the country. As they fought for the right to serve and then served valiantly, they provided communities and activists with the political capital or goodwill needed to stamp out Black laws and secure voting, education, and other rights for Black people. Black veterans, like those who participated in Iowa Battle Flag Day ceremonies in 1894, became important symbols and leaders in their communities as they participated in memorial celebrations and local, state, and national politics in their continued push for greater rights for Black Americans. However, the memory of the sacrifices made by Black Iowa veterans would fade as the Black men and women who served in the war passed on and reconciliationists tried to forget their contributions. Despite these efforts, the memory of Iowa's Black Civil War veterans lives on and will continue to grow brighter as we unshroud more of their stories and build upon their legacy in the present. Thank you.
Thank you, Dwain. We have just a few minutes to answer some questions at this time. The first question is, why were state regiments of African Americans like the 1st Iowa redesignated as UCST? Was it to aid recruitment like the Black men from Minnesota that Clark recruited who joined the 1st?
I think part of it was just to bring them under the umbrella of the federal government more, and to, in some ways, to combine regiments and also to bring in other companies that had been formed elsewhere too. So Iowa, for example, wasn't the regiment that was formed of the 60th was made up of soldiers from both Iowa, but also soldiers, in large part from Missouri as well, companies from both Iowa and from Missouri. So good question.
And during your research, did you find that Black Civil War soldiers in other states used the same reasoning to gain rights? If so, to what ends?
Yeah, I'm doing a lot more research on that, but the rhetoric that gets used, as I mentioned, of birthright citizenship, worthiness as to be considered citizens as a result of previous military service. This is a rhetoric that's quite prevalent throughout the country. And so that, is happening before the Civil War, it's happening during the Civil War, and it's being used after the Civil War. And so there actually are a number of states that after regiments come home, or even before they come home, actually, they're holding color conventions using the same kind of rhetoric and saying that because of military service, we deserve the right to vote. So yes, there's a lot of evidence to support that throughout the country.
Thank you for that additional information. And finally, this will be our third and last question. What role did newspapers like The Bystander play during this time period?
Yeah, that's a great question. Black newspapers were very important to creating this counter narrative that was circulating throughout states about Black people. Oftentimes, when Black people were ever mentioned, it was usually some type of negative, connotation associated with it through the white press. And so Black people, including Alexander Clark, who actually served for a time as the chair of the National Colored Press Association, found it very important to celebrate the great accomplishments and achievements that Black Americans were making. And so the Iowa Bystander becomes a crucial component of disseminating information to Black communities, but also in fighting for the rights of Black people as well.
And with that answer, we will bring this webinar to a close. I think we can all agree that this has been a very informative lunch. Thank you to everyone for joining us today. We hope that you will sign up for the Iowa History 101 webinars that take place on the 2nd and 4th Thursdays throughout the year. There are many great stories from Iowa's past to tell in the upcoming months. For more information and to register for future webinars in the series, check out our website at iowaculture.gov. This webinar and past presentations are available on our website as well. While you are there, you can look into some of our other fantastic digital programs, such as the Goldie's Kids Club activities for young historians, or watch videos of the Iowa Stories series, which is hosted by our Iowa City branch. We look forward to seeing you Thursday, December 9th for our next Iowa History 101 webinar. Thank you all again for joining us today, and have a great afternoon.